quietly walk in. Welcome to the Francis Lee Utley Lecture, sponsored by the AFS Fellows. I'm Marcia Godet, Vice President of the Fellows. The President of the Fellows, Frank DeCaro, has written the introduction for our speaker, but he is unable to present them today because of problems with his voice. He has asked me to read them to you, and I will try to do my best to do them justice. These are Frank's words. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker as the Utley lecturer, Elliott Oring, who is, I maintain, like olives, an acquired taste. He will speak on Back to the Future, Questions for Theory in the 21st Century. I asked Elliott to speak today, partly because he is a good speaker, unafraid to tackle the big issues in folklore, like transmission and function, partly because he is an old friend, going back to our days in Bloomington, where he, in fact, has just relocated. For whatever reasons, Elliott took to me when I first arrived in Bloomington and filled me in on what was going on at the Folklore Institute, the department then run by Richard Dawson. We became close friends. This was good because he had already been at IU for a year and could tell me the things I needed to know. When I first asked him to speak, I could not be sure that his topic would not be one related to humor, the subject of 7 of his books, going back to the first, on the Israeli Kisbot. He is also a past president of the International Society for Humor Studies, and a session will be devoted to his approach to humor at this AFS meeting. This will be held on Saturday at 2 p.m. in the Wayzata Bay Room. However, as I said, he has also tackled the big questions in folklore studies, and I hope that he would do so today. I have not been disappointed. His subject, folklore theory in the 21st century, promises just such an approach to larger issues. Unlike Big Joe McKennedy, who makes an appearance in St. James Infirmary, a song which folklorists like to trace back to the 18th or early 19th century street ballads, the Unfortunate Rake, or perhaps the Bard of Armor, Elliott's eyes are not bloodshot. However, I urge you to listen carefully to the very words he says in Back to the Future, Questions for Theory in the 21st Century.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, olive aficionados. Folklorists regularly complain that their work is ignored, misunderstood, or discounted by other academic disciplines, by governmental and non-governmental agencies, by corporations, the media, and perhaps even by God Almighty. Certainly when we publish an article on some particular tradition or group, someone in another discipline who is working with the same materials or with the same group is likely to become aware of our work, read it, and perhaps even reference it. Nevertheless, the overall assessment has long been bleak. And I quote, "Folklorists do not get the respect they deserve. The reception of folklore studies outside the discipline remains poor. Other disciplines are gaining ground that we should be occupying, and we lack visibility in national debates and matters of culture and politics. In the academy, folklorists are frequently marginalized and have had only grudging acceptance. Folklorists have a public relations problem and find themselves in a perennial state of having to explain themselves in different styles to different audiences while avoiding oversimplifying or undervaluing the academic rigor of their work. Such views precipitated Alan Dundas's invited presidential plenary address to the American Folklore Society in 2004, less than 6 months before his death. Dundas wanted to account for the discipline's marginalized status. His main diagnosis was the field's lack of a current body of native theory. Unfortunately, rather than outlining a theory or theories for the discipline, Dundas spent a good portion of that lecture criticizing Joseph Campbell, whose works, Dundas complained, seemed to fill the shelves of bookstores that were marked folklore and mythology. Dundas thought Campbell had captured attention that should probably have gone to academic folklore studies. Dundas criticized Campbell for his indifference to genre distinctions, his adherence to the notion of archetype, his belief in a collective unconscious, his assumption that certain myths were universal, and ultimately, I suppose, for his enduring popularity. He equally condemned folklorists for not having previously produced an interrogation and definitive refutation of Campbell's work. I can't remember exactly how many years ago I asked Henry Glassy why his writing about the Irish countryman seemed so excessively romantic and sentimental. His answer was, although I don't know whether he'll remember it or not, was that all folklorists are romantics, and consequently he wanted that romantic perspective to be explicit rather than concealed in his work. I could agree that if one were to operate according to a particular ideology, it was probably best to make that ideology visible rather than to allow it to remain tacit, perhaps even hidden from oneself. I did not agree, however, that all folklorists were romantics. I was pretty sure that I was not one. And there were other folklorists, both contemporary and bygone, that were not romantics either. I suppose if we must use labels, I would consider myself an Enlightenment rather than a romantic folklorist. That is to say, I'm concerned to understand and explain the kinds of expressions and behaviors that have come to fall under the rubric folklore. What were they? How'd they come to be? What did they mean? What were their effects? How and why were they maintained? And how and why did they disappear? The point was to collect materials, as we all do, categorize them, analyze them, and generate some principles to explain them. The Enlightenment agenda was rational and empirical. It involved ascertaining and cataloging facts, assessing and criticizing previous understandings of those facts, eschewing metaphysics, offering explanations and resubjecting those explanations to critical review. There was no place for intuitions, loyalties, sentiments, or wishes, at least as part of the program for analysis and explanation. It's probably not worth debating what percentage of folklorists are romantics. My guess is that Glassy was for the most part right. But I am certainly not the only adherent of Enlightenment thinking. And if we are willing to look back, we will find many others. One gaggle of folklorists working with a largely Enlightenment agenda could be found in Britain, running from the last half of the 19th century through the war to end all wars, a locution initially employed with no sense of irony. This was the era of the English Folklore Society, the time that solar mythologists, survivalists, and diffusionists stalked the landscape. Max Muller, George W. Cox, G. Lawrence Gumm, Alfred Nutt, East Sidney Hartland, Edward Clodd, William A. Clouston, Charlotte S. Byrne, and Andrew Lang, Moses Gaster, Joseph Jacobs, Marion Cox, and R.R. Moret. These people possess significant and diverse language skills and enormous erudition. And except for Muller and Moret, none held university positions. Most had day jobs, and they did their folklore scholarship after working hours. Max Muller was the creator of what came to be called the comparative or solar mythological school of thought. In Muller's view, the disease of language, the forgetting of the original meaning of the metaphors describing celestial phenomena, gave rise to perplexities that in turn caused stories to be created to account for these perplexities. And so mythologies, stories of the gods, arose to explain celestial metaphors whose meanings had been forgotten. Endymion is one of the names of the sun, but especially the setting sun. Selene kisses Endymion into sleep originally meant the sun is setting and the moon is rising, or it is night. As Muller felicitously expressed it, the gods are nomina, not noumena. The gods are names, not forces. The solar mythologists were resisted by the survivalist folklorists, taking their cue from E.B. Tylor. Survivals were those processes, customs, opinions, and so forth, which had carried on by force of habit into a new state of society, different from that in which they had their original home. Mythology, belief, and customs were not matters of philology, but of philosophy. With the evolution of culture, savage animistic philosophies disintegrated, leaving behind remnants which are noteworthy for their not being in tune with the tenor of the times. So if a riderless horse followed a caisson bearing the coffin of a high-ranking military officer, it is connected with the ancient funeral sacrifice and the custom of sacrificing the warrior's horse at his tomb, a practice that seems to actually have been performed for a cavalry general buried at Trèves in 1781. The point in recalling this account is to identify one of the great questions of folkloristics. What are the origins of human fantasy? This is what Muller and the survivalist folklorists were ultimately trying to answer. How did the Greeks, who gave the world critical philosophy, geometry, and democracy, at the same time worship a pantheon of gods and heroes whose exploits involved patricide, fratricide, incest, promiscuity, rape, cruelty, cannibalism, and bestiality? They were anticipating the internet. How did peasant tales come to revolve around similar kinds of episodes? Muller argued that they were to be understood as ancient metaphors whose meanings had been forgotten. Lang, Gum, Clod, Clouston, Nutt, Hartland, and Byrne argued for the survival of these ideas from a savage animistic philosophy. Forget for a moment the answers that they proffered. Whatever became of this great question? A second question raised by these folklorists addressed the nature of tradition. Tradition was already a defining principle of popular antiquities, what would later come to be called folklore. In his observations on popular antiquities published in 1777, John Brand argued that vulgar rites and popular opinions were descended from antiquity, and although probably mutilated in transmission, and although having outlived the general knowledge of the very causes that gave them birth, most retained some of the principal traits that distinguished them in their origin. These fancies, according to Brand, had been erased from the written record by public authority, but they were deposited in oral tradition which escaped such censorship. These fancies, ceremonies, and pastimes of the people, he said, often diverted them from an appreciation of their real condition and contributed to their oppression. Brand also cautioned that those who pursue such researches into tradition were likely to meet with both censure and contempt, but he urged that one should not be dissuaded by the seeming triviality of some traditions, as due diligence would often result in significant rewards. In these few pages, Brand seems to have anticipated E.B. Tylor's theory of survivals, James Scott's notion of the hidden transcript, as well as the notion of false consciousness, and perhaps even cultural hegemony. Brand also recognized the low status the enterprise of popular antiquities research would be accorded, so future folklorists had been warned. At any rate, it seems to me that there are almost enough ideas in the few pages of Brand's preface on which to develop an entire course in folklore. The Victorian Edwardian folklorists did not pick up on many of Brand's suggestions, and for brevity's sake, I'll just call the whole group the Victorians. Nevertheless, they claim tradition as their province and folklore as, quote, the science of tradition. Savage ideas were the foundations of peasant belief, custom, and literary motif. For these scholars, tradition operated invisibly and inexorably like gravity. Whereas Isaac Newton had given a precise mathematical description of the force of gravity, no such description was forthcoming from the folklorists for tradition. The best that might be said, although they never used these words, was that tradition was inertial in nature. Past ideas and practices were simply inherited unless there was something that actively interfered with that inheritance. Gradually, however, Victorian folklorists became alert to the problem of tradition. In 1893, Joseph Jacobs argued that folklorists would, quote, have to go more minutely into the modus operandi of tradition. F. York Powell, in his presidential address to the Folklore Society, felt that tradition as a process deserves examination. Charlotte S. Byrne, in her first presidential address, questions the blind acceptance of tradition. She asks why certain people should change their customs and why a custom should flourish in one place and die out in another. G. Lawrence Gaume remarked, the fact of tradition are sufficiently startling to need some scientific basis to account for them. And R.R. Moret, president of the Folklore Society through the period of the Great War, asked, how and why do survivals survive? Although the Victorian folklorists bequeathed us the question of how tradition works, they never really attempted to answer it. Most Victorian folklorists believe that peasant custom and belief rose in place, that it evolved from an earlier stage of local savagery. Thus, British peasant lore was a survival of British savage belief and ritual. In 1859, Theodore Benfey translated the Panchatantra, a book of tales first compiled in India, possibly around 300 BCE, that was subsequently translated into Persian, Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin, and from Latin into other languages of Europe. In that work, Benfey speculated on the Indian origin of tales, and a number of prominent Victorian folklorists, Clouston, Jacobs, Gaster, Cox, became advocates of the theory that tales crystallized in one place and then spread in written as well as in oral form. So a third great question bequeathed by the early folklorists concerned folklore dissemination and transmission. Transmission is not quite the same as tradition. Although there can be no tradition without transmission, tradition is transmission within the structure of an enduring social group. It depends on a process of cultural reproduction within the group, the replication of past cultural forms, meanings, and values for use in the present. Transmission implies no necessary enduring group, no necessary effort to replicate, no imperative for further use. It merely concerns channels and processes of communication and their consequences. So the Victorian folklorists, although not only Victorian folklorists, bequeathed us three great questions. What are the origins of fantasy? How and why are traditions formed, maintained, and extinguished? What are the dynamics of folklore transmission? Since the Victorians, folklorists have not put the origins of fantasy at the forefront of their researches. Nevertheless, it's good to be reminded that the field once entertained such truly grand questions in the study of humankind. Perhaps it will again. If Alan Dundas wanted to know one reason for Joseph Campbell's enormous popularity, it is that Campbell revived a question raised by the Victorian folklorists on the origins of mythological and folklore fantasy, and tried to address it in a series of works. Even if we may not agree with Campbell's methods and the answers that he proposed, he tackled the same question that had stimulated the public in Victorian times. Perhaps a second more important reason for Campbell's popularity, however, was that Campbell was not so much a folklorist, anthropologist, or even a psychologist as a metaphysician. His basic argument was that the myths and tales of peoples throughout the world contained a single unified message. That message was the material world is transitory. It arises from a source to which everything will return. This truth is only to be grasped by an inward turning. The journey is difficult, yet there is nothing to fear. This is the lesson that the hero brings back to the world. Campbell would seem to be some kind of latter-day Gnostic. That aspects of Campbell's argument touched on points in C.G. Jung's psychology did not really make his analysis of mythology and folklore fundamentally psychological, unless the ancient meaning of the word psyche, the soul, is what is intended. His work is and is meant to be a teaching for those who inhabit a material world in which they live without meaning and which they are fated to surrender at death. This is the source of Campbell's impact and popularity. Campbell's work is not really in competition with folklore scholarship. It did not really operate in the same conceptual universe, and it certainly wasn't the product of an Enlightenment program. If not much in the way of serious work by folklorists has gone into the origins of fantasy in recent times, not much has gone into the exploration of the modus operandi of tradition either. When Dan Ben Amos wrote his essay, The Seven Strands of Tradition, perhaps he intended something of a mea culpa for deliberately excluding tradition from his earlier definition of folklore. In the course of his exploration of the senses of the term tradition in the work of folklorists, Ben Amos makes two statements with which I disagree. The first is, and I quote, "In folklore studies in America, tradition has been a term to think with, not a term to think about. Elsewhere, I have argued that folklorists don't think either with the term or much about the term. The terms tradition and traditional are largely used to mark territory." I'll leave you to conjure up your own image for that. In other words, if something can be termed traditional, it's considered to legitimately fall within the folklorist purview. Folklorists actually think about particular traditions, quilts, proverbs, games, songs, legends, log cabins, and whatnot, rather than tradition. Ben Amos's second statement with respect to the seven uses of the term tradition is that, quote, "None is more adequate than the other. None is more proper than the other." Again, one of the senses of the term tradition considered by Ben Amos in his survey is tradition as process. This seems to me a key sense of the term, one more proper than the others, because it is process that makes product. And the process of tradition is a process of cultural reproduction. What are the means for reproducing cultural forms in succeeding generations within a social group? How is it done? What social relations aid or impede such reproduction? The Victorian folklorists didn't know and don't seem to have much cared. As I said, tradition for them was simply some kind of cultural inertia. For scholars who claim tradition as a key term, it's rather astounding that folklorists spend so little time in the close study of the means of transfer of knowledge and practice within social groups. Perhaps we believe that knowledge and practice are simply absorbed by a child with its mother's milk. If so, all I can say is we need to have that milk analyzed. At present, there is no focus in folklore studies on how knowledge, practice, belief, and skill are transferred in society. When we study children, for example, we are fixed upon children's folklore, not how children are socialized in the practices and beliefs that they will employ or abandon in their adult lives. Nor do we try to specify and isolate those aspects of social organization that promote or impede the transfer of certain kinds of knowledge. There is only a vague sense in folklore studies of how and when beliefs and practices get marginalized, disappear, or get revived. I could go on, but I will only point to something I've stated before. I repudiate the charge that folklore, by focusing on a dying or disappearing subject, is necessarily dying or disappearing itself. Try that argument out on undertakers and see how far it gets you. In studying the processes of tradition, folklorists are necessarily confronted with what is reproduced as well as that which is not. And when it comes to tradition, what folklorists should be theorizing are cultural reproduction, cultural marginalization, cultural disappearance, and cultural revival. These, to me, are utterly contemporary questions and make folkloristics an utterly contemporary field. The new can only be defined in terms of what it marginalizes or replaces. The new and the old are mutually constitutive. Folklorists do not have to find a contemporary subject. They only need to recognize that in the process of tradition, they very much have one. The question of transmission has not been much of a focus for study either. What has been studied is mostly a reconstruction from texts separated by time and space rather than a process amenable to close observation in real time. Certainly some knowledge was produced from the study of texts. In the course of their transmission, texts are expanded, contracted, fragmented, merged, localized, universalized, personalized, conventionalized, Baudelarized, sentimentalized, moralized, dramatized, and lyricized. Points of origin and routes of dissemination have been posited. It was not until the 1950s, however, that experiments on the process of tradition began to be published by folklorists, although the psychologist F.C. Bartlett had staked out the ground some years before and published results of his experiments in the journal Folklore. While some interest in transmission by folklorists emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it quickly evaporated. Nor has the emphasis on performance ameliorated the situation. Performance is focused on the individual event. It has been uninterested in sequences of events in which the dynamics of folklore transmission might be teased out. To date, the experimental and natural study of folklore transmission has been short and scattered. For example, after 40 years, we still have no definitive tests of Linda Daig's and Andrew Voshny's multi-conduit transmission hypothesis, or after 95 years of Walter Anderson's law of self-correction. With the creation of the internet, folklorists now have a means to follow the dissemination of folklore. In cyberspace, messages leave footprints. Time and movement can be tracked. Strings can be identified and monitored, and reproduction and recreation analyzed. The tracks of different kinds of folk materials, legends, jokes, beliefs might be pursued and compared as von Sydow wanted. Internet transmission networks and materials might be contrasted with oral face-to-face networks to grasp the difference in their dynamics and their differential effects on disseminated materials. This approach might be a more fruitful use of the internet than simply identifying and commenting on another curious meme in an effort to demonstrate there is folklore on the web. It's worth noting that our allies in such research are in the fields of communication, computer science, and yes, marketing. They are the ones that are studying why certain ideas and images become memorable and compelling, as well as how and why they spread. And it is my sense that they are way ahead of us. So what is my point? There are several, actually. Folklorists are usually off working on disparate projects in disparate places and disparate social groups with disparate traditions. One folklorist is studying duck decoys in Maine, another fiddling traditions in Missouri, one is documenting healing practice in Sierra Leone, and another is participating in an online chat group dedicated to science fiction, which is topographically nowhere. Other than saying that traditions are important and meaningful, and even that is not necessarily agreed on by all concerned, the general principles that emerge from folklore studies are elusive. The miscellaneous nature of folklore has always proven to be one of the problems of the field. I do not expect folklorists to leave off studying the things they love, nor would I suggest that they have not had some very interesting things to say about the traditions that they do study. But how does theory emerge from such a diversity of interests? Were folklorists to direct their particular researches to a delimited set of common questions, not just key words, they might increase the likelihood of producing theory. Theory would start out with low-level generalizations related to this set of questions. Inspired guesses and insights would also play a part. What questions? Well, perhaps some of the very questions that engaged earlier generations of folklorists: origins, tradition, transmission. Strangely enough, Alan Dundas might bear at least some small measure of responsibility for the lack of theory in folklore studies. Back in 1965, in his essay, The Study of Folklore in Literature and Culture, Identification and Interpretation, he urged folklorists not merely to collect folklore, but to interpret it. Dundas may simply have been echoing Stiff Thompson on the crux of folktale study as a search for meaning. In any event, folklorists would take up this injunction with a vengeance. We now publish interpretation after interpretation as we once published text after text. Folklore, I am told, is one of the interpretive humanities, which are, quote, are distinguished by an interpretive methodology, the use of text analysis, reflective thinking, and acknowledgement of audience to render something meaningful, to better appreciate the purpose of human existence, and to reveal wisdom, close quote. I can see how close reading and contextual considerations in the interpretation of a poem, for example, might enlarge an understanding of that poem, and perhaps even reveal something profound, wisdom. But how does one demonstrate that such an interpretation is the one the poet intended, or that it closely resembles what is received by other readers of the poem? Should folklorists not require that the interpretations they offer be built on firmer foundations than the interpretation of a poem? How do folklorists ensure that the meanings they perceive are actually those communicated in the real spaces of social life? How do folklorists persuade that the significance they attribute to folklore communications and performances are what they are claimed to be? It is not that an interpretation, the imputation of a meaning or significance, is necessarily wrong, but how do we ascertain when it's likely to be right? As it stands, there is no standardized methodology for the interpretation of folklore texts and events. There are no explicit rules of what must be included, excluded, emphasized, or repressed. There is no reason to think that an interpretation of one situation is analogous to the interpretation of another, even when proposed by the same interpreter. Folklorists would undoubtedly respond that in the context of performance, they have evidence for their interpretations. After all, I am also told, and I quote, in folklore, there is a complete integration between text and context. I would feel better about this assertion of interdependence if I could describe a context and then be informed which texts were necessarily performed, or if I could describe particular texts and then receive a detailed account of the situations of their performance. But such prognostications are never offered. Instead, we are told that a text is emergent in the act of telling. It is a creative act, which is another way of saying that there are almost no identifiable a priori constraints on the relations between text and context at all. The statement about the complete integration of text and context is really a statement about text and context being recorded and interpreted together as a unit. In other words, textual and contextual information are to be incorporated into a single metatext. They are both elements of the same poem that the folklorists are charged to interpret. One does not serve as a test for the other. How could such an interpretation ever be falsified? What data could ever be produced that might contradict I have long felt that literary critics should be given only the first half of a novel, play, or poem to analyze and interpret, and only after they had completed their close reading and interpretation should they be allowed to see the second half. In effect, I would be asking for an explication de demi-text. One might then be in a position to assess how well the interpreter's insights extend to and predict the missing parts. I don't think this school of criticism has yet been established. The propensity of historians, by the way, to write about the past rather than about the future is not unrelated to this point. Folklorists, however, would also argue that not only social context, but the commentaries of informants guide their interpretations. Dundas's suggestion in 1965 that folklorists elicit oral literary criticism from tellers and audiences was well received by folklorists in principle, but scarcely entertained in practice. Oral literary criticism is actually mentioned more frequently in Dundas's obituaries than in research articles. Furthermore, informants may be unable to state what the meanings of their verbal and behavioral traditions are, may be unwilling to state what the meanings are. They may disagree about the meanings or propose different meanings at different times. They may refer folklorists to other group members whom they regard as more expert to speak to the question, or they may articulate a meaning that seems profoundly at odds with the text or behavior under scrutiny. What does the folklorist do then? And even when informants can offer indications of meaning, these statements, like the other contextual materials, are also incorporated into the metatext the folklore is interpreting. So it seems to me that contemporary folkloristics suffers from two problems. What is usually construed as evidence for an interpretation is actually included in the data that is being interpreted. Text, context, and native commentary together constitute the greater text from which folklorists seek to extract some informing principle or pattern. Second, even when folklorists might persuade that their interpretations reflect what is actually going on in a social interaction, that interpretation always seems to remain local, situated, and does not lead to generalizable knowledge. Perhaps it is time for folklorists to assess where performance and contextual studies more generally have gotten the discipline over the last 50 years. Interpretation is a process of induction. Individual elements are perused in an effort to generate a principle or pattern that informs the object of study, the poem or fairy tale or storytelling event, to make it understandable. But that leaves the effort in a mode of producing induction after induction as the interpreter moves from one poem to another, or from one unique storytelling situation to another, or incorporates yet more data into what it is that is being interpreted. It seems the only way to break the never-ending cycle of induction and the sequestration of folklore phenomena in local contexts is to move from induction to deduction. When we come to what we think is some provisional understanding of the beliefs, practices, processes, or products that we study, we need to further ask, if my interpretation of this situation is correct, what else would have to be true? In identifying general principles abstracted from one's local interpretation, one should be in a position to frame propositions about other texts and situations that should prove to be either true or false. This constitutes the move from induction to deduction. It is not simply a statement of what we think might be going on, but a statement that if what we think is going on is actually going on, then certain conditions should obtain elsewhere. These kinds of statements are called hypotheses. And although there was a call for them in the 1960s and early 1970s, it would seem that only a few have been generated in folkloristics over the past half-century. But these are the only means of testing what it is we think we know. As a quick illustration of what I'm talking about, let us look at Dundas's interpretation of a tale that he presents in his 1965 essay, in which he enjoins folklorists to both identify and interpret folklore. Dundas in that essay transcribed a tale told about an Indian boy getting the best of an American soldier. The protagonist of the story is named Ptija, which Dundas convincingly argues is a distortion of Pigeon, so that the tale is in all likelihood derived from its French source. There are a number of inversions in the tale of what might be regarded as typical for actual relations between the American army and Indian society. The Indian outwits and defeats the American soldier. It is the Indian that gives the American food and spirits rather than the reverse. The Indian is able to keep the American's property as well as reclaim his own. The narrator of the tale seemed to express pleasure in its telling, and at one point in the story he says me instead of him, thus suggesting that the narrator identified with the tale protagonist. And Dundas concludes, quote, "One can see even from these few comments why this particular European tale could easily have been accepted by Potawatomi raconteurs and audiences. A few deft changes made it a tale with considerable appeal for the Potawatomi," close quote. Now, this is not the analysis of the repertoire of a particular social group, nor is it the most nuanced or sophisticated interpretation of a tale that one might come across. Although I would point out that nuance and sophistication might only count according to some scholarly metric while failing to capture anything that's actually going on in the social world. Dundas only meant this account to serve as an illustration, and that is all I mean for it as well. Nevertheless, even this very simple interpretation might generate some confirming or disconfirming hypotheses. For example, if Dundas is correct, then tales that invert relations between Indians and whites in favor of the former should be the best known and most widely spread. Or European tales adopted by the Potawatomi should be recast as tales of retaliation against the dominant society. Or the Potawatomi should not accept European tales that reflect their subordinate status and exploitation. Perhaps at some point in the course of a determined research program, one might even get to a hypothesis that proposes, at least as a strong probability, that subordinate groups accept folk narratives from dominant groups only if they transform them to promote their own status with respect to those dominant groups. Dundas's interpretation of the significance of the tale certainly makes sense, but without framing some hypotheses about what is implied by his interpretation, sense is all there is. How does Dundas and how do we know if he is right? Or to state it more precisely, how does he and how do we know when he is wrong? After all, for thousands of years, it also made sense to regard the sun as moving across the vault of the heavens perched over the disk of the earth. For most practical matters, this was good enough. Are we to advocate for our interpretations of folklore in society as simply being good enough? I think we need to try and formulate statements about individuals and groups that are founded on something more than sense. We need to make statements that in some measure can be tested. There will be those who say that the kinds of materials that folklorists deal with are of a special sort. They are subtle, ambiguous, contingent, blurred, and resist being transformed into hypotheses to be tested. There are even those who say there are no truths to be sought, or that truth is always local. I don't happen to believe it, but if that is in fact the case, why should we expect that anyone would pay attention to our field? What would be the generalized knowledge that the field of folklore produces that anyone else should be interested in or could employ? What is it exactly that we know to which others should pay attention? I am nearing the end of this talk, but in addition to the questions that the Victorian folklorists bequeathed us, there is something important we might learn from the manner and not simply the substance of their scholarship. Their scholarship was characterized by serious and sustained debate. The survivalist folklorists criticized the solar mythologists who responded in kind. The survivalist folklorists tended to disagree with the diffusionists who held that fairy tales were imported and modern rather than a survival from a state of savagery. Furthermore, the survivalist folklorists argued among themselves. Nutt disputed Gumm's claim to be able to separate out pre-Aryan Celtic, Roman, and Saxon ethnic strains in British folklore. And Claude scoffed at Lang's notion that something might be learned about folklore from the study of psychic phenomena. Their criticisms were sharp, yet gentlemanly, and often witty. Jacobs, in referring to assaults on his position by both Lang and Nutt, stated, quote, "I might perhaps manage with a little adroit dodging to cause their blows to fall reciprocally on one another. But I should by that means lose the fun of the fight myself," close quote. Where are the debates in contemporary folkloristics? Merely making a negative comment to someone, some coterie of friends about a colleague's paper presentation or journal article does not even constitute criticism, let alone debate. Genuine criticism is not something expressed privately to like-minded people. It is the product of deliberation. It is reasoned. It is organized. It is public. And it involves risk. What are the issues at stake in folkloristics today? Who are the advocates for one position or another? What are the ideas that are so passionately promoted and defended? If there are no clashes of opinion, if we are not excited about our ideas, should it come as any surprise that no one else is paying any attention to our field either? After all, it would seem we're not paying attention to it ourselves. In folklore, the tendency has been for theory to come from the outside. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. After all, the major theory that Alan Dundas championed did not originate within folkloristics either. But it also seems to me that the tendency of folklorists has been to read rapidly and widely in an effort to always be on top of the latest scholarly thing. There is a continual effort to gauge what is emerging and to ally with what is deemed to be in vogue. These theories are then trained upon one's own folklore materials. This is perhaps a practical strategy for those who find themselves as folklorists in a host of academic departments and programs, and who consciously or unconsciously conclude that they must show their own folklore work to be in coordination, if not close alignment, with those of their departmental colleagues. Yet in the creation of such scholarly solidarities, folklorists risk suppressing the interesting and important questions that arise from their own materials. They can find themselves forever engaged in the somewhat mechanical task of making their own materials fit somebody else's theory. The program does not seem conducive to the production of original observations or insights, and it certainly won't contribute to the building of a body of native theory. It also seems odd that folklorists who claim to value the old and the marginal, when it comes to theoretical matters, are engaged in a frenetic pursuit of the new. It may be that we as folklorists need to slow down, to stop and smell the roses, to revisit our disciplinary past, reread or read for the first time the works of those who came before, pay them some of the respect they deserve, and re-engage some of the questions and concerns that motivated their studies. Perhaps in that interlude, we will not only find our disciplinary past, but find our way to a disciplinary future and discover something about ourselves along the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elliott. Many things to think about. Our time is up, so he we won't have questions now, but I encourage you to talk to Elliott afterwards. Thank you.